Moral injury cannot be adequately understood if it is treated solely as a psychological disorder. While it certainly involves emotional suffering, guilt, shame, anger, despair, its defining feature lies deeper. Moral injury strikes at a person's moral identity and their sense that the world itself is morally intelligible. At stake is not merely how a person feels, but whether they can still believe in the meaningfulness of moral life. This is why moral injury repeatedly resists reduction to diagnostic categories such as PTSD. It belongs at the intersection of psychology, ethics, and what can broadly be called the spiritual dimension of human existence. What makes moral injury distinct? Moral injury arises from participation in, failure to prevent, or witnessing acts that constitute serious moral transgressions, acts that violate deeply rooted moral convictions. These experiences generate suffering with a specifically moral quality. Unlike fear-based trauma, which is primarily reactive to threat, moral injury involves moral judgment, responsibility attribution, self-evaluation as a moral agent. Those affected are not simply afraid of what happened. They are haunted by what the event means about themselves, about others, and about the world. In severe cases, moral injury undermines a person's sense of themselves as a good or trustworthy moral being. Moral injury as a reactive moral experience. Moral injuries are best understood as a form of reactive moral attitude. They are not deliberate decisions or chosen beliefs. They are suffered responses that arise involuntarily when moral expectations are shattered. These reactions contain an implicit moral judgment. This should not have happened. I should not have done this. The world should not be like this. The experience is evaluative as well as emotional. It reflects a strong sense of moral responsibility, often stronger than average, which is why morally serious individuals are disproportionately affected. In moral injury, it is not one isolated norm that collapses. Morality as a whole is placed under strain. The three dimensions of moral life. To understand why moral injury is so destabilizing, it is helpful to distinguish three dimensions of moral existence. Normative dimension, knowing what is right and wrong. Motivational dimension, having the will and capacity to act on what one knows to be right. Meaning dimension, believing that moral action makes sense in the world, that morality is not futile. Moral injury is uniquely devastating because it attacks the third dimension. The person no longer trusts that moral effort matters or that the world supports moral action at all. This is why sufferers often describe feelings of alienation, cynicism, or moral homelessness, loss of trust and moral alienation. Those living with moral injury frequently describe loss of trust in themselves, loss of trust in others' moral motivation, loss of trust in institutions or moral frameworks, loss of trust in God or ultimate meaning for people of faith. This erosion of trust produces a form of existential alienation. The world no longer feels like a place in which one can be morally at home. Withdrawal is common, not merely as avoidance, but as a response to perceived moral unworthiness. Many come to believe they are beyond forgiveness, beyond repair, or fundamentally contaminated by what they have done or witnessed. Isolation then deepens the injury. Reconciliation with reality. Recovery from moral injury cannot mean returning to who one was before. That expectation is unrealistic and in many cases harmful. The more appropriate goal is reconciliation with reality. This involves acknowledging the violation of deeply held moral convictions, recognizing the limits of one's control and agency, reassessing responsibility in a broader moral context, learning to live forward without denying moral seriousness. This process is not about excusing wrongdoing. It is about redrawing moral boundaries around agency and accountability in a way that allows moral life to continue. Compassion and mercy, often initially received from others, play a decisive role in this process. The role of the spiritual dimension. The spiritual dimension becomes relevant because it addresses questions that psychology alone cannot fully answer. Why be moral at all? What does forgiveness mean? How can guilt be carried without destroying the self? Is moral failure compatible with human worth? Spirituality here does not require formal religious belief. It refers to any framework that provides existential meaning to moral life, whether theistic, philosophical, or humanistic. For many, religious language of guilt, mercy, forgiveness, and grace offers symbolic resources capable of holding moral failure without annihilating hope. For others, moral repair occurs through deeply human experiences of shared vulnerability, compassion, and recognition of common humanity. Spirituality as ambivalent power. The spiritual dimension is not automatically healing. It is profoundly ambivalent. It can intensify guilt, reinforce self-condemnation, strengthen narratives of unworthiness, but when integrated carefully, it can also reopen access to meaning, support moral humility, enable forgiveness without denial, sustain moral identity after rupture. Effective therapeutic approaches therefore do not impose spiritual interpretations, but make space for them when they are meaningful to the individual. Moral culture and shared responsibility. Moral injury is never purely individual. It emerges within social, institutional, and political contexts. A meaningful moral culture acknowledges moral burden, makes room for confession, accountability, and forgiveness, does not abandon those who have borne morally impossible situations, resists the temptation to reduce moral suffering to individual pathology. Shared humanity demands that societies take responsibility, not only for physical harm caused by war, but for the moral aftermath borne by those who served. Concluding perspective. Moral injury reveals something uncomfortable but essential. Human beings are moral creatures whose suffering cannot be fully explained without reference to meaning, responsibility, and identity. Healing does not consist in erasing the past, nor in restoring innocence. It consists in learning how to remain a moral being after moral catastrophe. If moral injury teaches anything, it is that moral seriousness is not a liability. It is a mark of humanity. The task is not to silence conscience, but to help people live with it when the world has made moral purity impossible.